us here. So it is 9:30. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It looks like we have a small group with us here today, but I'm sure people will start to trickle in a few minutes late. I just want to welcome everyone to our winter Title II and Professional Learning and Induction briefing. If you haven't done so already, we're asking everyone just to share a tradition in the chat box that they're looking forward to maintaining this holiday season, even though the holidays are going to look a lot different for most of us. Hopefully, we still have opportunities to keep up some of the traditions that are important to us. So if you haven't done so, please take a minute and share in the chat. Our agenda today, we're going to spend the first part of our morning reviewing the relationship between feedback, professional learning, evaluation, and high quality instructional materials. We have some researchers here from the RAND organization who are going to lead us through this discussion and share some of their research with us around this content. Then Judy Kowarski from MSDE is going to spend just a couple of minutes with you just reminding you about the MSDE CSM project, the Curricular Support Materials project, and what that looks like and how individuals from your local school system could be involved in that. And then finally, we have a few folks from our Office of Certification here to talk with you about performance assessments and how you at the local school system can support teacher candidates who are already employed but who have not yet been certified. Then we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So in just a moment, Julia Kaufman and C. Doan are going to join me on stage. I do want to tell you just a little bit about Julia and C. So C is an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and his research uses quantitative methods to study K-12 education policy with a focus on issues in teacher effectiveness and teacher labor markets. And Julia Kaufman is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and her research focuses on how states and local school systems can support high quality instruction and student learning, as well as methods for measuring educator perception and instruction. So we're really excited to have them here with us to share their research. Before we call them up on stage, though, I do want to ask everyone to take just a moment and reflect on a question via a poll. So the question is, in your local school system, when a new curriculum or curricular support materials is rolled out, what supports are put in place for teachers? So let me get out of here real quick. I'm going to display the poll results, and I think Jen has placed the link to the poll in the chat. So we want to just take a quick peek at what supports are put in place in your local school system. You can vote for all of these or one or two, however many you want. So take a minute, review the question, and click what responses fit your local school system. And C and Julia, you can join me on stage at any time at this point. Okay, not surprisingly, the top two, I think, are most popular. Not as much self-paced training. Looks like that might be starting to creep up a little bit. I do want to point out that we do have like two different options for self-paced training. Self-paced training with no accountability, mean teachers and instructional staff are just left to their own devices to access that training. And then also access to self-paced training with accountability. So there's some sort of accountability measure in place to ensure that teachers have, in fact, undergone the training. So let's take one more minute and kind of reflect on what practices currently exist in our local school systems. Okay, looks like the results have kind of stopped trickling in here. So I'm curious, C and Julia, does this ring true? Does this seem to align with the research that you've seen nationwide about the supports that are put in place when new curriculum is rolled out? Is anything popping out to you?
Yeah, it definitely resonates. I mean, we didn't ask about all the things that are listed here, but we'll be talking about the collaboration that teachers across the United States say they do with other educators to learn how to use their materials, the coaching. We'll talk about feedback from administrators. So all those things are pretty relevant to our presentation, and it'll be interesting to share these results and see how much they align with what folks in school systems are doing.
All right. So I do want to kick it over to Julia and C at this point. C, you can share your screen.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Great. Well, I'll get us started. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to talk to folks from school systems. It's always good to get feedback on our work and understand the messages that our work is providing to folks, and what is confusing and what can support your work. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We are going to be talking about results from a survey that's been fielded in 2019, 2020, and now will be fielded again in spring 2021. So each spring we fielded this survey to teachers and school leaders. And the primary objective of this work is to understand what materials teachers are using in their classroom and what factors support the use of those materials. We're also trying to understand the standards aligned practices that teachers are engaging in the classroom, as much as we can measure that from a survey, and understand the things that are related to more standards aligned practices. So we'll be talking about some findings from a report that we released earlier, actually late in the summer. And I think a lot of the results connect to what you all are doing to support curriculum use in your school systems. Oh, and I did want to say that the holiday tradition that we're looking forward to maintaining in my house is Advent calendars. We love doing Advent calendars, and we doubled down this year and got a cheese Advent calendar and a chocolate Advent calendar. And so even though we're looking at each other all day, every day, and not every day seems like the last, at least we have like a new cheese and a new chocolate. So I just was thinking about that whenever all of you folks kind of shared your traditions. Okay, well, let's get started. Next slide, please. So I'll just talk a little bit about the survey source that we used for this data. It's the American Educator Panels. And the specific survey that we'll be talking about is the American Instructional Resources Survey. So I'll give you an overview of those. Then we'll step through our key findings. And then we'll talk about the things that we're doing next for RAND's American Instructional Resources Survey. Next slide. And actually, so this presentation, we've done it a number of times. It is based on published findings. So you actually should feel free to be able to share this presentation with others. But if you want to cite it in any of your work, you should feel free to check with us first, just to make sure that you have the right site. But otherwise, feel free to share. So what is the American Instructional Resources Survey? I talked a little bit about it. In spring 2019, and these are the results I'm going to share with you today, it was fielded to a sample of over 1,600 school leaders and nearly 6,000 English language arts, math, and science teachers. We have state-level samples in a number of states that are specifically focused on curriculum reforms. That doesn't include Maryland, and so mostly today I'm going to be focused on our national findings. The American Instructional Resources Survey, as I said, focuses on instructional material use, how and why materials are used, and what factors support their use, so we can really understand what's happening at a national level. Next slide, please. So one important point is how we define standards aligned materials for this work. They could be defined in a lot of different ways. We rely on the Ed Reports definition of alignment because Ed Reports has reviewed the greatest number of texts published curriculum. And so we have 3 different ratings for the that we assign to materials the teachers say they use based on Ed Reports reviews. One is fully aligned, meaning that the material meets expectations of Ed Reports at the grade level that the teacher reports that they're teaching. Partially aligned, which is the partially meets expectations rating by Ed Reports, and then finally not aligned if Ed Reports says it doesn't meet expectations. Of course, there are lots of curriculum that are not rated by Ed Reports at this time, and so we do have an unrated rating, as well as whether teachers sometimes do not report using particular curriculum materials, in which case we have a no curriculum rating. I know curriculum materials is the term that most of you are using, and that's the term that we'll try to stick to throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to C, who's going to talk through our findings on instructional material use.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so what we ask in the survey, and so we have both a teacher survey and a survey for school leaders. And so for the teacher survey, we provide teachers with a long list of different curriculum materials, and we ask them, which of these materials do you regularly use, which we define as using once a week. And so we ask a similar set of items to school principals, but rather than what materials they use, we ask what materials they require or recommend. And we ask teachers and school leaders to check all the boxes that apply. And so we use that to kind of get a survey of across the nation, what are the different curriculum materials that teachers are using in ELA, mathematics, and science. Next, we take a look at these curriculum materials that teachers and school leaders say they use or require or recommend, and we match these to those Ed Reports ratings that Julia had just talked about earlier to see what percentage of materials are teachers using or principals requiring or recommending that are rated as standards aligned according to Ed Reports. And then lastly, we take a look at how teachers might use multiple curriculum materials all in concert with one another. And so that's considering how much are they modifying materials and number of different materials that we're using. And so we'll report out on what we found are some common profiles for how teachers might use different curriculum materials in combination with one another. And so the highlight here and the key takeaway from our findings is that we found that most commonly required curriculum materials in 28-19 was not standards aligned. And often there were materials that were created by districts, schools, and teachers. And so it's really important to note here that this does not mean necessarily that these are not high quality instructional materials, right? Simply that they weren't rated by Ed Reports. But we found that the most common materials across all grade bands and subjects was very often materials that teachers said that they created themselves or schools and districts created. And then when we'll talk about this too in the last part, but although these curriculum requirements likely have a loose relationship with what US teachers use every day for their instruction. And we'll talk about that in terms of how teachers might combine these different materials together to form their lesson plans. And so what we see here on this slide is, so this is specifically for math curriculum materials. And what these are the top 4 math curriculum materials that school leaders said that they either required or recommended that the teachers in their schools use. And so on the far left, you can see the top 4 most common materials in elementary, which is Engage New York, Go Math, Envision Math, and Curriculum My School or District created. In the middle, those are the top 4 for middle school. So Go Math, Engage New York, and again, Curriculum My School or District created, and curriculum that teachers create themselves. And then lastly, we see for high school teachers, the top 4. And there you see those school district created materials and materials that teachers create themselves kind of top the list. And so what we see kind of across this is in elementary school, the top material that was required or recommended was Engage New York, which is rated as a fully aligned material by Ed Reports. But in a lot of the other grade bands, many of these materials were not rated as fully aligned, or they were materials that teachers were creating themselves or their school or district were creating. And so what we do here is we look across all of the different materials. So remember that principals don't have to select just one single curriculum material. They can select all of the different curriculum materials that they require or recommend in their schools. And so we look across all of those and we say, okay, of all the different materials that you say you required or recommended in your school, is there at least one that's rated as fully aligned by ed reports? And so what you see here is what we sometimes call a best case rating, right? So what you see in the green bar on the left is that 41% of principals required or recommended at least one math curriculum material that was rated as fully aligned by ed reports. In the yellow bar, you see that there's 24% of principals that rated or that required or recommended at least one partially aligned curricula, but they didn't require or recommend any fully aligned curricula. And so you can kind of see that shifting bar upwards in terms of what we mean by a best case rating. And so one of the interesting things here is that you see 3 bars. And so on the far left, that's the percentage in terms of what principals are saying that they're requiring and recommending in their schools. The middle bar there, we're taking that from the teacher survey. And so what we see here is these are the percentage of teachers that say that they're regularly using at least one fully aligned curricula. And so we just kind of focus in on the green bars here. We see this kind of interesting pattern, which is that 41% of principals reported requiring or recommended at least one fully aligned curricula, but only 29% of teachers said that they regularly use a fully aligned curricula. And all the way on the right, we kind of filter down even more specifically. And so we look specifically at teachers and what materials that they said they use for over 50% of instructional time. And there, the percentage of using fully aligned curricula is even smaller at 22%. And so this kind of shows this sort of interesting funneling, right, in terms of what school leaders are requiring and recommending, what teachers are actually using in the classroom, and then finally, what teachers are using for the majority of the instruction in their classroom. And so there's sort of interesting trend in terms of kind of the pathways between requiring or recommending a high quality material and then what actually gets used in the classroom. Here, I'm going to show a very similar set of slides, but for ELA curriculum materials instead of math. And so here you can see the big trend is a lot of gray in all of these bars, right? And again, particularly middle and high school curriculum materials that my school or district created and curricula that teachers create themselves are among the most common materials that principals said that they required or recommended in each of these grade bands in ELA. And so this, again, shows that kind of best case scenario rating and with the 3 different columns. So all the way on the left again. So again, this is ELA curricula. This is the percentage for principal. This is the percentage across all of the curriculum materials that teachers use. And then on the far right, we see this is the percentage for the curriculum materials that teachers said they use for over 50% of their instructional time. So again, we see that same similar pattern, right? More principals are requiring or recommending the use of at least one fully aligned curriculum material than teachers are using. And then more than that, teachers are using for over 50% of their instructional time. And then lastly, we do take a look at science. And so the science curricula, the majority of these, so ed reports ratings are still very early in their process of rating these materials. And so the majority of these are unrated. And a couple of them that are rated red, which means that they're not aligned with standards materials. But again, the prevalence of curriculum materials that school or districts create themselves and curriculum materials that teachers say that they create themselves, those were the most common curriculum materials across all the different grade bands in science. And so next, what we realize is that, we ask teachers and principals alike, to note all the different curriculum materials they're using. And so what's really important to note here is that many teachers selected more than just one curriculum material. And so we were kind of interested in the different ways that teachers might combine to kind of form their lesson plans. And so kind of pouring through the data, we came up with these 4 mutually exclusive profiles of how teachers might use curriculum materials. So on the far left, we call these like by-the-book teachers. And so what is a by-the-book teacher? By-the-book teacher is a teacher that uses a single published curriculum material. So that means a material that's like published externally and not a material that they're creating themselves or school or districts are creating themselves. And they make modifications to less than half of classroom lessons. So as the name of the profile suggests, they're kind of using these materials by the book. The second profile is the modifier. And so these are teachers that also said that they're using a single published curriculum, but they're making a lot of modifications to this material. So they're making modifications to more than half of their classroom lessons. The third category are cobblers. And so these are teachers that indicated using multiple published curricula regularly in the course of their classroom instruction. And then lastly, we have a category called the DIY teacher. And so these are teachers that say they only use curricula that they're creating themselves, or they're using a combination of published curricula and self-created curricula, but they're using that self-created curricula for the majority of their instructional time. So what do we see in terms of the percentages of how many teachers fall into each of these categories? We see that the most common profile were the cobblers. So 37% of teachers in our survey in 2019 indicated they use multiple published curricula regularly. Next, we're by the book teachers. And so, a little more than a quarter of the teachers fall within this category of, I use a single curriculum and I don't modify it that much. I more or less use it, kind of as intended. And then that's followed by the DIY teacher, where 19% of teachers were primarily relying on materials that they were creating themselves, and then modifiers. So these teachers using these materials, these published materials, but modifying them extensively. When we look at how these profiles break out by subject area and grade level, we see that in most subject areas and grade levels, the most predominant profile were these cobblers, right? So that kind of fits the national trend. But we do see that, particularly in math teachers, the most common profile was actually by the book teachers. And then within elementary school, that was kind of equally split between cobblers and by the book teachers in terms of these profiles of instruction. In addition to curriculum materials, we also asked teachers about what were the most commonly used digital materials that they used to help plan their instruction. And so Teachers Pay Teachers was very, very popular, where 56% of teachers indicated that they used Teachers Pay Teachers regularly. And this is followed up by just using search engines and Googles to find different resources. And resources obtained through searches on Pinterest were also common. And then lastly, we took a look at teachers and what they used in terms of digital materials that they were using as a part of their classroom instruction. And so again, this is broken out by subject level. And so you can see that resources such as YouTube, Kahoot, and Khan Academy were among the most popular digital instructional materials that teachers were reported using in their classroom. All right, and we'll pause here really briefly for questions on any of the content in terms of what teachers nationwide reported using in the classroom, and then what that relationship is with the Ed Reports ratings.
Okay, so at this time, if you have any specific questions for C and Julia, and again, we're just pausing. This is part one. We're going to pause for a second, see if you have any questions for C and Julia. If nothing's popping up in the chat, then we're going to break back to floor mode. And in your floor, in the floor mode, we'd like you to chat with a few individuals at your table about these two questions. So in addition to alignment to standards, what other factors make curricular materials high quality? So the Ed Reports ratings really focus on alignment to standards, which is a super important aspect of making materials high quality. But what else makes materials high quality? And then the second question that we want you to think about is, considering the information that Julia and C just shared regarding the prevalence of curricular modifications, how might this impact students' equitable access to high quality instruction? So those are the two discussion questions we want you to have in just a moment. We did not label tables by local school system this time because we'd like you to kind of get a few different perspectives. So it's not necessary that you find anyone from your local school system for these table talks. We'd like you to just find any table that you'd like. So I will reshare these questions in the chat once we break out to tables. So Julia and C, I don't see any questions specifically for you in the chat. So perhaps something will rise up during the table talk discussion, and we'll reconvene in about 6 minutes as a full group. So that'll bring us at 10 o'clock, we'll reconvene. All right, we are back. So I'd love to hear from one or two people, either about what factors make curricular materials high quality other than standards alignment. Are there other aspects of materials that you think are super important that should be evaluated? I'd love to hear someone's thoughts on that, any good, rich discussions you had. And then maybe one or two people to share what was discussed at your table regarding how might curricular modifications impact students' equitable access to high quality instruction. And it could be a positive impact or it could be a negative impact. So if you'd like to share, just in the chat, can you say, I'll come up and I'll bring you up on stage so that you can share with us. And Diane, yes, the presentation is being recorded. Anyone want to come up and share? Don't be shy. All right, thanks, Jackie, for kicking us off. All right, Jackie, you're getting an invitation from me to come up on stage.
So one of the things that we consider when we're looking at curricular materials that are high quality, definitely the alignment to standards, but also what research-based practices, research-based strategies and evidence-based practices are incorporated within those curricular materials, I think are important too. So it's aligned to the standard, and what strategies are we implementing and practices to make sure that students are understanding the curriculum. And then also looking at the materials to make sure they're of high quality, that they have that lens of equity and cultural responsiveness within them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that Julia and C are going to speak about what their research has shown around evidence-based practices and their alignment to, or how they relate to high quality materials. So really good point. Also, I know that when Judy comes on to share about CSM reviews, that cultural responsiveness and that equitable lens are both factors that are reviewed or rated in the Maryland CSM reviews. So thanks, Jackie, for bringing up two really important points. I appreciate that. Heather, what did you want to share?
We just had a really interesting discussion about kind of the difference between what we might think are high quality versus what makes a teacher perceive something as high quality, which kind of stemmed from why teachers do trust things like teachers pay teachers. And so from their perspective, it's kind of ease of use, like it's, kind of neatly packaged, but it's also just the idea that perhaps they trust other teachers because if another teacher's used it, there's evidence, at least anecdotal, that it helped kids learn or it engaged kids. So that was just, I thought, an interesting take on, the definition of high quality from a teacher perspective.
Yeah, really good point, Heather. Thanks for sharing. Did anyone want to speak to the second question about how might curricular modifications positively or negatively impact students' equitable access to high quality instruction? Did anyone get to that question? Maybe you didn't because it was only 6 minutes. But if there is someone who, if you did and you'd like to share, can you just let us know in the chat and we'll pull you up? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any volunteers, so maybe this is just a question to keep in the back of your head as Julia and C continue their presentation about how might these curricular modifications impact students' access. So Julia and C, you can come back up on stage, just turn on your microphone and camera, and then you can share your screen.
Okay, thanks, C. It was really interesting to hear some of your perspectives, especially regarding teachers' perceptions. We've actually been thinking a ton about that because I think, Heather, that you're totally right that teachers' perceptions have a lot to do with what they use, whether they think a material is engaging, usable. And so we're putting out a publication soon that focuses just on how teachers perceive their instructional materials, because we do agree that's like a huge factor in what they use. But next, what I'm going to be talking about are the ways that teachers say they're being supported to use their curriculum materials. We call them, in our work, we call them instructional system elements. that support teachers' use of materials. And the things that we measured in our survey, and there are other ways things that we may not be capturing, but with the two things that we focus on are how much do teacher evaluations, observations, and principal feedback take curriculum use into account, and how much do teachers report participating in professional development focused on their curriculum materials? And we'll capture some of the things that you were asked about in the poll and do in your school districts. Next slide, please. So the key findings that I'm going to be focused on are, first, that, and this is perhaps not surprising, most U.S. teachers report that their principal and their professional development focuses at least somewhat on their use of materials, although there are certain types of professional development that very few teachers say they get. That's focused on their curriculum materials. And collaborative learning was really the most common way that teachers indicated receiving support to use their main materials, and it's actually the thing that they indicated most helped them use their instructional materials. So that's just food for thought as I walk through these findings. Next slide, please. So this all reflects the conceptual framework that we're working on right now. This is an in-process conceptual framework, but it captures the things that we think are important to measure to understand what teachers are using in their classroom and what kinds of instructional practices that they are engaged in. And so you see instructional practices at the center, and that those are just the things that teachers say students are engaged in doing, the activities that they're engaged in doing every day in the classroom. And we think that there are multiple things that could be influencing that. Among the things we measured are use of curriculum, principal evaluation and feedback focused on curriculum use, and professional development focused on curriculum use. So we'll talk about, C talked about, use of curriculum. Now I'm going to be talking about professional development and principal evaluation and feedback. And then broadly, we think about the state and how it supports these pieces of district and school context. Next slide, please. So first, going to talk about teachers' agreement with all of these statements about how their principal supports them and the evaluation and observation they get. So you can see here that most teachers indicate that their evaluations, observations, and principal feedback take into account their curriculum use, but there are a lot of teachers that disagree with this statement. Just majorities do agree. So you can see here that English language arts and math teachers are about on par in how much they say how much they agree that their principal encourages them to use existing curricula versus encouraging them to plan lessons from scratch. And you can see here that between half and about 3/4 of English and math teachers indicate that their principal knows which curricula are and are not aligned with standards. Their teacher evaluations take curriculum into account, and their observations take into account their use of required curriculum. In science, fewer teachers say that all of these are the case, but still majorities in most cases. Next slide, please. So again, collaborative learning is the main way teachers indicate getting professional development focused on their main materials. And of course, many of you said that teachers also get initial professional development and training, but generally we find that those workshops and trainings don't happen as often as collaborative learning, and that makes sense because workshops and trainings are often one-shot deals. Sometimes they help teachers at the beginning of their use of materials, and maybe that's revisited in the next year, but more often, more regularly, teachers are getting collaborative learning with other teachers, and that plays out in our surveys. Of course, for science, teachers say they're getting less of that than for math and English language arts. Coaching and workshops, teachers indicate doing less often. Still doing, but doing less often than that collaborative learning. Next slide, please. So we're going to stop here. These are the kinds of supports that we focused on in our survey, and we'll be talking in the next section about how those are related to curriculum use. But we have a pause here to make sure that you all don't have any questions for us. And then I think that they'll be moved to table talk. Is that correct, Heather?
Yes, that is correct. So let me replace my screen. Okay, so we do want to pause again just for a second and see if there are any questions for Julia and C at this point. If not, then we want you to reflect on your response to the poll question that we posed at the beginning of today's session around what supports are evident in your local school system when a curriculum or a curricular support materials are rolled out. So what supports has your local school system prioritized when introducing new materials? So that's kind of like part A. But part B is, what about when you're introducing new teachers to existing materials? So it's kind of two different things. One, when it's new materials being rolled out in the system, and then two, and this is, for our induction folks, how are you introducing new teachers to existing materials? So that's question one. And then, do you see a need for any reprioritization? If so, what might that reprioritization look like? Okay, so no questions have bubbled up in the chat yet for C and Julia. So I'm going to send us back for about 6 minutes. Okay, so we are back. I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to share about any reprioritization that you might consider, maybe some components that you think you might consider adding, or if anything was illuminated for you regarding specific content areas or grade levels, anything that bubbled up. If you'd like to come up on stage and share, you can just say, I'll come up. Or if you'd like to, if you're more comfortable sharing in the chat, that's fine too. But I'd love to hear just from one or two people about what this is bubbling up for you in your local school system, and the supports that you offer to either new teachers in their use of existing curricular support materials, or the supports that you offer to all teachers when rolling out new curricula or curricular support materials. Anybody? Thanks, George. Bringing you up now. All right, George, come on up. You can turn on your microphone and camera.
All right. Good day to everyone, first of all. But with the Allegheny County Public School System, one of my jobs is to supervise secondary social studies teachers. So from that perspective, first and foremost, one thing that we like to do is, well, what I like to do is draw as many teachers in as possible when we're actually doing any type of revisions. And with that being said, then once we roll things out, we tend to, roll them out to the whole group. And then we basically have a few people from, each school who act as mentors for not only new teachers, but veteran teachers also. But it's really a collaborative effort, I want to say. But as far as new teachers go, one thing that we'll do is again, it's my responsibility as a supervisor to introduce the teacher, but then we assign a one-to-one mentor for that new teacher to assist them as support. So it's ongoing, it's collaborative, and we've had some relative success with it, and I truly believe that the more folks we include in the creation and ultimate rollout, the better off everyone will be.
Yeah, that's a great point, George. I think specifically, like, what role can our mentors and coaches play in giving feedback to teachers and collaboratively planning with them around the use of curricular materials. So really good point, George. Thanks for sharing. It looks like Leslie has a few things in the chat as well that she's dropping. I'll give everybody a chance to read that. Yeah, really good points, Leslie, about the role of the coach and ensuring that the coach has the opportunity to really execute their vision and their role, what it means to be a coach, and not being pulled away for other duties as assigned, which we know happens so frequently. So really good point, Leslie. Okay, I think Julia and C have one more section of their research to share with us. I'm going to invite them back up on stage to join me. Just turn on your microphone and camera, C and Julia.
All right. Okay. And so now I get to talk about the part that ties everything we just talked about together. And so in the first section, I talked a little bit about what teachers are using, what different types of curriculum materials are being used in the classroom. And then Julia talked about what's in the green and orange bubbles of that conceptual framework that she outlined, which is professional development focused on curriculum and principal evaluation and feedback. And so in this section, what we're going to talk about is how those three bubbles, the purple, green, and orange bubbles, how they relate to the thing that's in the blue, which is the presence of standards-aligned classroom instructional practices. And so what are our key findings here? Well, what we found were Julia's bubbles, the principal and professional development focus on curricula. Those things were related to teachers' reports of whether or not all their students were engaged in standards-aligned classroom practices for ELA, math, and science. What we did not find was whether or not they used a standards-aligned material. We didn't find that that had any relationship with the percentage of standards-aligned practices that teachers reported their students engaging in. And the second kind of key part here is that state and school context, as well as grade and subject taught, that's going to govern a lot about how all these components are related. So how these relationships work will differ between Maryland and California teachers. And then even within the state of Maryland, how these relationships might work might differ between Maryland social studies teachers and Maryland science teachers. And so how do we measure classroom practices? So this is a really, really tricky thing to do in a survey, right? So we can't use observers, we don't have a standardized test or anything like that to rely on. And so we asked teachers themselves to kind of report on. And so we worked through this list with content area experts and different folks from different policy organizations when developing the survey to come up with a list of what we consider to be standards-aligned classroom practices. So you can see that we have different sets of items in the three different subjects. So reading fictional and non-fictional texts of sufficient grade level complexity in English language arts. Math, relating new math content to other math content within and across grade levels. And in science, justified or scientific reasoning in writing. And so these are just some of the examples of the different practices that we used. And so we asked teachers to report on the percentage of the students in their classroom that are engaged in each of these practices. And so what we kind of used is pretty simple, really. We just used what percentage of these different items that we asked about did you report that all of your students were engaged in within the classroom? And so we took that percentage measure and we wanted to see whether or not that was related or not to whether teachers, A, use a standards-aligned material, B, the extent to which they were receiving professional development related to their curriculum use, and then C, the principal evaluation and feedback supports that we had discussed earlier. And so what did we find? So relational finding one, we didn't find a clear relationship between whether or not teachers use a standards-aligned material and these standards-aligned classroom practices. And so some of the reasons why we think that might be the case. So remember when I talked about that funneling, right? We had a large percentage of teachers or principals reporting that they were requiring or recommending standards-aligned materials, and then a smaller percentage of teachers saying they were regularly using it, and then an even smaller percentage of teachers saying they were using it for their main instructional time, the majority of their instructional time. And so kind of the things that are being required or recommended or teachers saying they're regularly used, that may not necessarily be what's kind of cropping up actually in classroom instruction in ways that change, student practice and student behaviors. And so that might be one plausible hypothesis. The other thing, and kind of what we had talked about in terms of the discussion questions, is that, there's lots of different ways to define the quality of instructional materials, right? And so when we look at the Ed Reports ratings, we're focused very specifically on kind of their adherence to state standards, but there may be other elements of quality that are missed. And so that might be part of the reason why we don't find this clear relationship between whether or not an ed report's rated material is fully aligned was linked to the percentage of standards aligned practices we see in the classroom. We did find strong relationships between the other two components, though. And so teachers receiving that they received more professional development focused on their curriculum materials. These teachers were more likely to report that students engaged in a higher percentage of these standards aligned practices. And similarly, teachers that reported that they received more evaluation and feedback from their principals that was focused on curriculum, these teachers were also more likely to report higher percentages of students engaged in these classroom practices. And then the third thing is that DIY teachers were also likely to report all their students engaged in standards aligned practices. And so kind of looking back to those profiles of use that we had talked about before. And so this is sort of an interesting finding. And so we kind of read this in one of two ways. One is that if teachers are creating a lot of their own materials, you might think that they can kind of tailor their materials specifically to the needs of the students within their classroom. The other thing that we do find, though, is that part of this might be the types of teachers who are DIY teachers. And so in our survey, we found that teachers serving a lower proportion of their students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, these teachers were slightly more likely to be DIY teachers. And so you might sort of see some of that contextual relationship play into the fact that we find that DIY teachers were more likely to report that their students engaged in standards aligned practice. And kind of speaking specifically to that point about the comparisons between low income and high income schools. And so we kind of find this kind of interesting paradox in our findings, which is that teachers in low income schools, they both reported higher levels of school and PD focus on curriculum, but yet they reported a lower use of standards aligned practices. And so that kind of runs counter to that relationship that we talked about a little bit. And we think that part of the reason why we're seeing this is actually because that these teachers in low income schools, they are getting more of these supports, right? They're getting additional professional development focused on curriculum. They're getting more principal evaluation and feedback focused on their curriculum use. But that in and of itself may not be enough to sort of overcome other disadvantages, more other difficulties of teaching in low income schools. And so what's important to note here is that these resources tend to help teachers serving lots of different types of schools, but teachers in low income schools may need even more of these supports. And I'm gonna switch it back to Julia to summarize our findings.
Okay, thanks, C. So I'm just gonna walk through all the key findings that we already shared with you, just to kind of drive the points home. So most commonly required curricula was not standards aligned, often created by districts, schools, and teachers. That doesn't mean that it doesn't fit a definition of high quality that you may have in your school district in some ways. It doesn't mean that there aren't other pieces of a high quality curriculum. It's just using our measure of standards alignment. Most US teachers reported that their principal and their professional development focuses at least somewhat on use of curricula, and collaborative learning was the most common way teachers indicated receiving support, as well as the thing that they thought was most helpful to them. Higher principal and professional development focus on curricula were related to teachers' reports of their standards aligned curriculum practices for ELA, math, and science. And the use of standards aligned materials was not. And C gave a lot of different reasons for that. I loved what George said about, wanting to get teachers involved in working on curriculum and curriculum use. I think that's another factor that might encourage them to use curricula and engage in practices that are in the curricula that you think are high quality. And that's something that we've thought about a little bit, but I think we could think about a little bit more and try to measure in our surveys. And lastly, state, school, and teaching assignment contexts are related to how teachers use curricula, the school and professional development supports they get, and the engagement of their students in standards aligned practices. So all these things are sort of connected together, and we think point to the need for supports for teachers' use of curricula, but also trying to think about all those other pieces of the puzzle that kind of work together to support teachers. So next slide, please. These are just some implications. There may be some that come to mind for you, but these are implications we've put together based on our surveys and based on hearing from school system leaders and teachers. So principal and professional development supports focused on curriculum use may support standards aligned practices, the practices you want to see in the classroom, more than the curriculum itself, which isn't surprising considering how much teachers modify their curriculum, how much they're bringing in other things into the classroom. And so those supports like principal and professional development guidance on curriculum use may be most important. States, districts, and professional development providers, you may all wish to consider what instructional profiles are most common for the subjects and grade levels on which you focus. So you recall that C talked about those by the book teachers, those cobblers, those DIY teachers. What profiles are most prevalent in your school system? Because it varies, right? In our findings, it varies by subject level, and it also varies by school level. And so an elementary ELA teacher may be doing something very different than a high school ELA teacher. So thinking about that could also help you think about the supports that are necessary. And collaborative learning, as I said before, it seems to be one particularly fruitful avenue through which to offer additional supports. And lastly, teachers in high poverty schools likely need much more scaffolding and additional support to use. Standards like curricula or any curricula, defined as high quality by your school, district, state. And so teachers in those high poverty schools likely need additional supports that maybe they're not getting. Next slide. So that's all of our findings. We really appreciated the opportunity to share with you and wonder if there are any additional questions for us.
So I think what we'll do is we'll take about, let's say 15 minutes. That's going to put us at 10:50. And in those 15 minutes, what I'd love for you guys to do is, number one, give yourselves a little break. If you need a little bio break, grab a coffee, use the bathroom. And then in your groups, I want you to think about these three kind of reflection questions. Number one, what's squared with your beliefs around curricular support materials? So what's just reinforcing what you already knew, felt, or believed about curricular support materials and the required professional learning and supports necessary to ensure that teachers are executing those practices effectively. Number two, what key points do you want to remember from this presentation? So what's the new learning for you? And then number three, any questions that are still circling in your head. So we'll come back at around 10:50 and we'll see if any of those questions that bubbled up at your tables you'd like to ask Julia and C, and then we'll send Julia and C on their way and thank them. So we will reconvene at 10:50 as a group at your table. Decide if you want to do a little 5-minute break first and then come back and discuss, or if you'd like to discuss now and save the last 5 minutes of your 15 minutes for your break. So we will reconvene at 10:50 as a group. Okay, so before our break, these were the questions that we asked you to think about at your tables. And really, we'd like to just focus on any questions that are still circling in your head. Julia and C are coming back up to answer any questions that may have bubbled up in your discussions. So if you have any questions, you can either pop them into the chat or you can say, can I come up or something along those lines, and we'll pull you up on stage to ask any questions directly. So we'll wait another minute or so. Okay, it doesn't look like any questions are circling. I know for me, one of the things that kept bubbling up in my head was the connection between what was being shared by Julia and C, and just coming back to that READY framework. If you guys remember from last school year when we had Itai Mizrav from AIR and GTL come share with us how oftentimes the professional learning that we provide to high need schools does not align with their actual need. And I think that this could be some of this research, I think, could potentially illuminate the impacts of that. So even though those high need schools are receiving higher levels of professional learning or more frequent professional learning, it's not necessarily always resulting in the changes, those high impact strategies that we want to see. So how can we ensure that our high need schools are receiving that type of scaffolded support that they really do need to ensure that those evidence-based practices, those evidence-based strategies are being implemented. It looks like Bridget popped a question in the chat. How can we better support principals in providing curriculum-based feedback on observations and evaluations? So Julia and C, have you come across this in your research about this being done well anywhere, any particular takeaways around that?
That is such a good question, because I think that as you might expect, I'm sure that there is a diversity even within the same school district of how principals approach this. And this question makes me want to go back and dig into our data and think about maybe the things we have a principal survey we shared a few of the results from. So it would be really interesting to dig into that principal survey and understand what might be related to principals saying, I focus on curriculum with my teachers, and what are the things that might be encouraging principals to do that. And I would expect, and I think C would probably agree with me, that there is a relationship between when you ask teachers, do principals know about the strengths and weaknesses of curricula, and do they support curricula? I think there's probably a strong relationship between those. So I think it speaks to the fact that principals, if they know more about the curricula pros and cons, they'll be able to support teachers better. I don't know, C, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and the other comment I would have there is that it makes sense to target some of those resources specifically for principals providing feedback, specifically for science teachers as well. So as what Julia was mentioning in the slides, right, there seems to be sort of a lower rate of science teachers reporting that they're getting some of this feedback from their principals. And part of that is a pipeline issue. And so what we see in kind of other research is that, there are just fewer principals with kind of prior science teaching background, right, relative to math and ELA. And so part of that is just, maybe encouraging some of those teachers to maybe take the pipeline to the principalship. So you have school leaders with this sort of very specific science content background. They can provide more specific feedback to teachers on their science instruction.
That's a good point. Any other questions that are still circling that anyone wants to pose to the group or to Julia and C before we let them go? Okay. Well, on behalf of all of the professional learning coordinators in Maryland and the Title II coordinators and our induction coordinators, we really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your research. I know for me, it's brought up a lot of thought-provoking questions, and I'm sure it has for our folks as well. So we appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, glad to hear that. Thank you, everyone.
All right, so we are going to transition now over to Judy Kowarski, who is the specialist for our Curricular Support Materials Initiative. She's going to come up and share with you just a little overview of what's being done around the CSM.
Thank you, Heather. This is actually a great segue because the CSM is really designed to address a lot of the issues that were raised by the RAND study. So in this presentation, we're going to give an update on the Curricular Support Materials Initiative and to introduce it to those who might not have heard about it before. We're going to outline the goals and the components of the initiative, describe the Maryland rating factors, provide login credentials to access the CSM portal, and share information about how you or your staff can participate. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. The main goal for the initiative is to increase student achievement across our state. And as the RAND research asserts, one of the mechanisms to improve achievement is through the effective use of vetted high-quality instructional materials. When high quality materials are coupled with implementation supports, what Rand referred to as instructional system elements, such as professional learning, we maximize the fidelity of implementation. So through the CSM, we are promoting the networking and collaboration to support selection of and use of high quality materials across the state. We provide Maryland educator ratings as well as links to national alignment and evidence-based research findings, and we facilitate professional learning. Next slide, please. An online CSM portal has 4 main components. To facilitate networking, we compile an inventory of curricular materials in use across Maryland districts. This first component was actually the original idea for the CSM, that MSDE would support districts in talking with one another about what they're using, how well it's working, and how they might even collaborate around use of those materials. Cecilia had written this federally funded state grant for that particular purpose. And I came on board to manage this grant and realized how so much of the research indicated that we could really take it a step further in terms of these 3 other components. So we have, at this point, fully developed the system to incorporate all of the components. Through a partnership with Ed Reports, the CSM portal provides standards alignment reports, and the majority of CSM reviews relate to the latest editions. As Ed Reports catches up with its reviews of the latest editions, we incorporate those in the CSM portal. Evidence levels and links to evidence-based research articles, such as those available from the Wetworks Clearinghouse and the Johns Hopkins University Evidence for ESSA, are also available in the portal. So you can see we're beginning to make this a one-stop shop so that each district or school, for that matter, need not fetch on its own for all of these important components. And then last but not least, the portal displays the CSM ratings and narrative comments from Maryland educators regarding standards alignment and the degree to which materials meet the diverse needs of students and teachers. Here you can see these are the state-defined rating factors produced by our Maryland stakeholder groups. It's important to note that the CSM content-specific factors go beyond the scope of what is rated by Ed Reports. CSM, ELA, and mathematics ratings correspond to the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards, and we're in the process of outlining rating factors for science. Cross-curricular or universal rating factors were identified by stakeholder groups through the ELA, mathematics, social science, and science briefings, and through statewide surveys. And some of these, as you can see listed here, actually came up during today's table talk about what else we must care about as we review materials beyond alignment to standards. Once the key factors were identified, we partnered with WestEd to articulate the definitions and indicators in concrete terms. We based ourselves in the research of the best practices regarding these factors, and we developed training materials to guide statewide teams to conduct reliable and trustworthy reviews. Next slide, please. Shown here are credentials for logging into the CSM portal. And of course, all of these slides are available to you, so you need not take all of the notes here. Next slide, please. We invite you to participate in the CSM initiative. There are a couple of ways in which you can do this. First of all, we invite content specialists, teachers, administrators, and coaches to sign up for notifications regarding CSM reviewer training and reviewer team workshop schedules. We offer CPDs for training and review team participation. Also shown here is a link to our form for recommending materials to be reviewed in the future. What we hear from CSM reviewers is that they often consider, as a result of their training and their experience with CSM review teams, incorporating CSM ratings or the protocols for the CSM review process in their own local review or adoption process as they consider new materials. We also hear about the value of taking a fresh look at the materials currently in use. Looking at these rating factors, many of our districts find that they're finding a lot of value in seeing how they can recognize where professional learning around some of these factors might be relevant to what materials they have in use today. They can also identify where materials in use might need to be supplemented by additional materials. And we're happy to work with local systems to incorporate some or all of the rubrics and protocols used in CSM in the local adoption process. So I'll pause now and ask if there are questions or any discussion items that you have in mind regarding the CSM process.
It doesn't look like anything's bubbling up in the chat, but this would provide a great way, as George mentioned, to get teachers involved in curricular review and feedback around curricular supports. This is a great way to do that. Okay, well, I don't see any questions popping up, so thanks, Judy, for sharing just a little update on where we are with the CSM.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so we're going to completely shift gears here. Our last presentation today for you is coming from our Office of Certification. So I would just want to invite Carla Enriquez and Nicole Obregon to join me on stage. Carla and Nicole, remember, you just need to turn on your microphone and camera. That's going to bring you up. So Carla and Nicole have some really interesting updates to share around performance assessments and what that means for you at the local school system level in supporting teacher candidates who will be taking these performance assessments. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Nicole can share hers.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. We're going to make performance assessments as lively and exciting as we can. This has been a long meeting, and thank you for sticking with us. As Heather said, I'm Nicole Obregon, working in the Division of Educator Certification and Program Approvals. Specifically, I work with the Teacher Collaborative Grant. I'm a grant specialist there, but Carla and I have been working very closely together in speaking about performance assessments and the local school systems and how this affects teacher candidates.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Carla Enriquez, and I'm the State and Federal Reporting Coordinator for the Division of Teacher Certification and Program Approval at MSDE. We would like to thank today, Heather, you for giving us the time to talk to you a little bit about the new testing requirement for teacher licensure in Maryland. Very important requirement, performance assessment that will be required in Maryland in the upcoming year. So some of you might have already heard about it. So we want to make sure that we give you just a little overview of the assessment, the requirement in Maryland, the timeline, as well as some considerations for local school systems. So I would like to turn it to Nicole to begin with a few of the slides to begin talking to you about the performance assessments as well as the requirements in Maryland. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you. Sure, most of you in this room are already familiar with what a performance assessment is, but this is just a brief overview as we head into really delving into the requirements. Performance assessment in terms of candidate assessment just assesses the candidate's readiness to enter the classroom and be the teacher on record and assume all the responsibilities of an entry-level teacher. It also evaluates how the teacher candidate plans and teaches lessons, learning who their students are as learners, assessing their content knowledge and how they meet the state standards in their certification area, how they deliver instruction, assess their students, reflect on lessons, and fulfill their role, their professional responsibility role within the field of education and in their school communities. The performance assessment requires the completion of written commentary and the submission of artifacts. And this also includes video submissions. In more recent years, candidates must upload video clips of them teaching that meet certain requirements according to Pearson and ETS. Those are the two companies right now that we're using. There are some circumstances where audio submissions are allowed, and those audio submissions must be transcribed. They're getting a little more into the next few steps of the presentation, but those are only under certain circumstances for certain tasks and best connected with Pearson and ETS on a case-by-case basis. But that is what all the performance assessments require. It's rubric-based, and it is a portfolio, not a traditional paper and pencil written test. So that is what a performance assessment is. What does Maryland require in terms of teaching certification? As of last year, the Maryland State Board of Education approved the adoption of ETS, an Educational Testing Service, PPAT test, and Pearson's EdTPA as two approved performance assessment measures. Teacher candidates must present one of these assessments, and this is beginning July 2022. It's in the upcoming 1 or 2 school years. And these two tests, the PPAT and the EdTPA, will be replacing the current Principles for Teaching, Learning and Teaching PLT praxis assessments for all teaching certification areas. Are there any questions so far? That was just an overview. Are there any questions so far about performance assessments or Maryland certification requirements? I'm not able to see when I'm presenting, so.
Nicole, there are no questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, Carla Enriquez will now talk a little bit about the important timeline that's coming up.
Thank you, Nicole. So the timeline approved by the State Board of Education in Maryland is meant to enable a gradual progression to full implementation. As Nicole mentioned, by 2022, candidates will be required to take either the EdTPA or the PPAT in placement of the PLT. However, from June 30th of last year to June 30th of 2022, candidates may present either assessment, the EdTPA, PPAT, or the PLT to meet the pedagogical assessment requirement. Those areas, there are a few areas that do not require a PLT, and those are not required at this time to present a pedagogical assessment. Between 2019 and 2022, no passing score is required. However, the test has to be scored nationally. From July 21 to 2022, July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2025, all teacher candidates who are required to present Maryland certification tests will be required to submit an approved performance assessment. That could be either the LTPA or the PPAD. No passing score is required, and again, they have to be scored nationally. By July 1st, 2025, all teacher candidates will be required to present a performance assessment for certification, and a passing score will be required at that time. And again, the test will have to be scored nationally. The intention of not requiring a passing score from 2019 to 2020 to June 30th, 2025 is to make sure that that gives the state enough time to collect scoring data from all of those candidates who are taking the assessment between that time and analyze and therefore set a passing score during that time. With that in mind, as we work with EPPs who have been implementing the assessment before this was a requirement in Maryland, as well as Pearson and ETS, the state found that there are key items that need to be in place in order to create a smooth transition to full implementation for either assessment and to make sure that test takers are successful. So we have here some considerations that we have found to be needed to share with you. You might be part of the implementation process of this assessment in your local school system, as not only candidates that are affiliated with an EPP will be required to take this assessment, but also new hires that are coming from out of state that require to take Maryland tests. So one of the considerations that we have put it here for you, and this is really, I think, where we will like for your department, as well as the certification department at your local school system, to begin thinking about and to begin having a conversation of how test takers, new hires will be supported at the local school level. So our first consideration to keep in mind is to identify a performance-based assessment coordinator or team at the local school system. That is just something that we have found at this time needed, so that conversation about how this will be implemented, what kinds of supports will be provided at the local school system, and also the other pieces about the video recording will take place. There's a lot of policies that this assessment will require at the local school system level, because that is where the administration of the test will happen. And so we think that your department, as well as the certification at the local school system, will need to collaborate to make this happen. So some of you might be part of this team as your local school system begins to put a system in place. Next, Nicole. Another consideration that we are putting encouraging local school systems and EPPs to have in place is to establish channels of communication between districts and EPPs. Some of the EPPs in Maryland have already been implementing this assessment for a while. There's an LTPA collaborative, and right now Maryland's also forming PPAD collaborative of higher ed institutions. and I believe also local school systems that will, provide support and more information about either assessment, and also just to discuss the challenges that are happening through the process of implementing the assessment. So just facilitating that communication, establishing, knowing who to contact from the local school system to the EVPs is recommended. We also recommend to locate key resources published by the assessment vendors. Pearson, as well as ETS, have an immense amount of resources in their websites. The MSD is also creating a page only dedicated to the performance assessments where you will be able to find lots of resources and just links to the vendor sites just to facilitate that, just searching for information. And so definitely at this time, to become familiar with the assessment, to become familiar with the requirements, and to be able to understand what it takes to administer the assessment. So we highly recommend that. Both IIA as well as PPAD, Pearson, and ETS are providing training sessions for the next year, starting in January. So this is something that we have communicated to higher ed institutions as well as local school systems to attend those training sessions. There's lots and lots of information that they are providing through those webinars, especially regarding implementing the assessment in the virtual environment, which has created a lot of difficulties at the local level. So through these trainings, all that information is being discussed, and we highly recommend participating in those sessions. Connect with or develop a support group. Again, I mentioned collaboratives that are being formed in Maryland. We have a very solid IIA collaborative, and currently there is progress towards creating a PPAD collaborative. All that information we have. If your local school system begins to think about how to be part of those collaboratives, please feel free to reach out to me or Nicole or to the certification office, and we can connect you with those contacts. And then this is really important, this consideration here. This is where most of our conversation is going at this time, just because of what we're in right now, the virtual environment. But this assessment will require to develop policies and procedures and form language regarding videotaping. As of right now, I know IIA is allowing transcription, audio. There are just lots of legal issues that go along with this particular assessment. So this is a very important conversation to be having, to set policies, forms, and this is where probably the team will have to spend a lot of their time. This information is being shared also in those training sessions, so this is why it's so important to be part of those, and to make sure that everybody involved at the local school system is knowledgeable about the requirements of the assessment at this time. I think there's a few more, Nicole, that we have in here. Very important point to discuss how your district will educate parents, especially regarding that recording, the video recording component for teacher candidates. What language will be on that form? How will parents be be informed and notified of what is happening in the classroom. And the last one, very important as well, is to make sure that there's a plan in place that all employees, including conditional and out-of-state hires, will need to take the assessment and submit the assessment by July 1st of 2022. So this is very important because these test takers will not be affiliated to an EPP, which might mean that they will not be receiving those reports that an EPP offers. Therefore, the local school system will probably need to have conversations about what kinds of supports will be put in place to ensure that those new hires that require Maryland testing will be, successful in taking this assessment and submitted and passed by July 1st, 2022. So we know it is a lot of work that needs to go into as we move towards full implementation of the performance assessments. And we wanted to share this information with you as we think that, conversations have or will begin to happen at the local school system, and you will probably be part of that team. So with that being said, if you have any questions about the requirements, about the assessment, about any of the recommendations we have presented, please go ahead and write it in the chat. And Heather, if you can let us know.
Yep, you've got
Also,
three. You've got 3 questions in there already.
Okay.
Do you need me to read them to you? Or
I can't see them, Heather.
Okay, so Jamie wants to know, to clarify, school systems will be required to supervise the EdTPA or PPAT process for teachers hired from out of state who did not complete the performance assessment in college, correct? So that's part A.
Yeah, I would like to, I think Kelly has something to say. Kelly is the certification director for OR division. She's very familiar with the regulation requirements. And so I want to make sure that we are getting a clear answer to that question because this is in regulation. Go ahead.
Sure. So, and I think that was Jamie's question, right, Heather?
Yeah, that was part 1 of Jamie's question. She has a follow-up there as well.
Yes, to clarify school systems.
And then the second part is this for initial certification, or does it only apply to experienced teachers we hire out of state?
Okay, so let me tackle the first part of the question first. So required is a weighted word. No, you're not required to support them. You've noticed today that Carla has said the word recommend or guide or, consider, because, the bottom line is a local school system can be as supportive or non-supportive as they choose. And, from a local school system perspective, from an MSD perspective, we can't tell you, yes, you have to supervise your EdTPA and PPAT test takers because that's going to help them get through the assessment. System, I would think that you would want to provide some type of support, some level of support for those people, because if you don't, then I would guess that they have a more likely chance of not remaining in the school system and not passing the assessment, and then you're not retaining them and you're recruiting someone else, all of that. So for the purposes of retention, recruitment and retention, that's really, I think, where you need to come at this from. And then whatever makes sense to your specific local school system is what you're going to put in place. And that's, I'm sure, going to look very different across the 24 local school systems. So hopefully I've answered that first part of your question, Jamie. If not, just throw something else in the chat. Is this for initial certification only, or does it also apply to experienced teachers? That's a great question, Jamie. So under our current regulations, we have pathways that allow individuals who are experienced professionals in other states and people who have gone to school in another state and chosen to get their certificate in that state. They have pathways into Maryland that do not require that they sit for Maryland assessments. And this is a Maryland assessment requirement. So for the time being, the only out-of-state guys that are going to need to take this assessment are those that can't come in via one of those pathways. And you can certainly work with your certification office to understand those pathways. Now, that may change depending on if the blueprint for Maryland bill ends up passing this session in the form that we saw it last year. Because in that form, it said that every single person that applies to be a teacher in Maryland needs to take the assessment, period. So that's a really big difference. So something to keep your eye on. But I think I've answered both of those questions.
Jennifer has a question. She said also, how does this align with the alternative certification pipeline?
Right. So the alternative certification programs, just like our traditional programs, are obviously having to adopt these assessments as well. They should be going through the process now, because just like everyone else, just like the traditional programs, come July 1, 2022, candidates are going to have to be able to hand us that assessment to get certified. So hopefully the alternative programs right now are kind of shifting things around and figuring out how they're going to support their candidates in-house to get through this assessment. I would think, and again, this is just me thinking, it's going to look a little bit different probably in every single alternative program, but I would think that, the counties that have the alt programs are kind of going to be ahead of the game, because you all are going to have people on the ground that have to do this. It's what they're enmeshed in. It's, they get their candidates through the programs. So they're already looking at this, hopefully. They certainly know about it. So that's definitely, if you're lucky enough to have a resident teacher program within your county, and Jennifer, I don't remember off the top of my head if Howard does, then you should make friends with those people and start having conversations with those people and invite those people to be part of your team.
There's one last question from Jamie. For those out-of-state new hires, who selects EdTPA or PPAT, the school system or the teacher?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A candidate can submit either, right? So there's no wrong answer there. However, as a local school system, you may decide based on several factors, whether you have an alternative program that's chosen something specific. What traditional programs do you have interns filtering into your classrooms? Like, there's a lot of factors to consider. You are probably going to lean towards one or the other. And as an employer, you can certainly provide your support depending on how you lean. So there's nothing stopping you from being an employer and saying, you know what, I'm just going to take Howard County as an example. Anyone that comes into Howard County and is on a conditional certificate and they're not enrolled in an educator preparation program, we're going to support them do the PPAT, because that's just our comfort level and that's what we're going to train to do. So if you want to work for us in Howard County, then that's what you're going to take. And that's an employment requirement. Now, that doesn't mean they could go take the EdTPA by themselves somehow and present it. It would still work. But I think that you'll decide, like, how are we going to support each assessment? With that being said, it's important to understand that if you have interns from an educator preparation program that is using the other assessment, they will be in your classrooms too. So although you may not have to support them in the way that you would have to support someone who doesn't have a college behind them, you are going to need policies and procedures that allow that assessment to take place. And that's the last question I see.
So do we have any other questions for Nicole or Carla or Kelly at this time?
And Heather, while we give them just another moment, I just kind of want to take a large step back and make sure that everyone understands that the reason that, you know, our team is here today and we are working internally with Heather and Cecilia and their team is because all of us recognize that the people on this call are probably the people that are going to be tapped to help support candidates or employees get through these assessments, because that's what you do. So that is why we thought it was so very important to kind of bring you into the conversation now, because 2022 is going to be here before we know it.
Yep, exactly. So that brings me to ask Cecilia to come up on stage with us as well. So when Cecilia and I were hearing from Kelly and Carla and Nicole about this legislation and where it was headed, a lot of these considerations take funding. It takes time, it takes money, it takes resources to do these things. So I think Cecilia wants to talk to you just about a little opportunity or a little consideration that we're thinking about.
Okay, hello everybody. It's nice seeing you all virtually. It's nice seeing some familiar names and see all of you again. When Kelly's office presented this to us, Heather and I talked about this, and we decided that it was really important. This is a huge change. So we felt it was really important that we do something to support you. So we are setting aside $200,000 of Title II money. Now, I know that's not a whole lot of money, but it's better than no money. For any of you who might want to consider some of the things that was shared with you today. So I did a screenshot of the consideration slide, and I'm going to share that again with you real quickly. So looking at those considerations and thinking about those kinds of things that the certification office is asking you to consider doing in order to support performance assessment for uncertified teachers, Heather and I decided it would be a good idea to give you some funding. And as I said, we set aside $200,000 for this purpose, for you to do some of these things. And you can decide how to use that funding as long as it's within allowable activities within Title II, because it is Title II funding. US Ed is actually becoming much more strict with auditing and with spending of state level funding. They've always been very strict with the spending of LEA funding. However, more recently, they've become more strict with, they've always audited us on the state level, but more aligned with how you are spending your money. In the future, their audits are going to be much more rigorous, asking us how we are spending our money. So they're going to want to know if you agree that this is a good use of Title II funding. So Heather has created a survey, and I think Heather's going to put the link to that survey in the chat. And we really need at least one person from every single district in the state to complete the survey for audit purposes. We need to let MSDE know that this is something you want. If it's not something you want, don't feel pressured to answer that way. But we're going to need this for our records. And we're going to need to make a decision about which districts are going to get which funding. So that's another purpose of the survey, to make those kinds of determinations and how much funding to give you if you're even interested in this set-aside funding. So Heather, I'm going to turn this over to you for a minute to talk a little bit about the survey and what we discussed about how we're going to allocate the funding.
Yep. And Cecilia, if you can stop sharing your screen, then I'll share mine. Okay. One second here. Okay, so the survey has a couple of questions. The first question is just your local school system. Again, that is just an accountability piece that we have to ask. So, you know, what's your local school system? The next question is, do you agree that this is a good use of Title II funds? Yes, I do. No, I don't. Or I'm unsure. I don't have a strong opinion. Those are your options there. The next question is about allocation. So do you think the set-aside fund should be allocated using the traditional Title II formula, which takes into consideration population and poverty? Or do you think it should be more of a competitive type application process, where if you want a piece of the funds, you apply for them, and then we allocate funds based on approved applications? Or option 3 is, I'm unsure, or I don't have a strong opinion.
I'm going to jump in here for 1 second and just mention that this is a small amount of funding. So if we are using the formula approach, which is fine, I want to remind you that if you don't get a lot of Title II funds, then the amount of money you get using that approach will be much smaller than somebody who gets a lot of Title II funds, because it will be directly related to your formula.
And so I also want to say that right now we've set aside $200,000. We also know that right now there are a lot of conversations about how are we going to spend this surplus of funding that we have right now. So some of you have a lot of money left over because your PD has been canceled because of COVID and you're not sure how to spend it. So we've initially set aside $200,000. It doesn't mean that if we need to set aside more that we could potentially look into doing that. But for right now, we've started with 200,000. And these would be FY21 funds, so the newest grant. So that's an important consideration. And then our last question here was really added for the purposes of the certification office. So what Kelly and Carla and Nicole want to know is there someone else in your local school system who really needs to know this information and who needs to be a part of this conversation, and they're not here today? So if you click yes on this question, it's going to take you to the next section, which is contact information for up to 3 people. If you click no on that, it's just going to take you to the end of the survey. But if you click yes, it's going to ask you to put the name, email address, and job title of a person in your LEA who's not here today, who needs to be a part of this conversation. And Carla and Kelly and Nicole are going to reach out to those individuals and share this information with them as well. So that's the survey. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And I just want to remind everyone that we really need one person from every district to take the survey for auditing purposes for USAID for use of money. That's very important.
And also for the certification office. I know they want to know, who else needs to hear this information. So any questions for any of the group? We're about 20 minutes early on our wrap today. So any questions for the group? I do have like 1 or 2 more slides, I think, to share here, but.
Doesn't look like anything showing up in the chat.
Nope, it does not. Okay, so nothing showing up in the chat. So our last slide is just a couple of reminders of upcoming things. Number 1, FY19 evaluation reports are due on January 31st, 2021, unless you extended your FY19 grant, which a lot of you did. So if you did take advantage of that extension, then you have an additional full year and you can submit your evaluation report anytime during that extra year. But for those of you who did not extend, just a reminder that that report is due at the end of January. And then this just goes to speak to something that I mentioned just a few minutes ago is I've been receiving a lot of phone calls and emails about spending. And so the question has been, is the federal government going to again extend the FY20 grant period as they did for FY19? And right now we have no answers to that. And my advice is always have a plan B or a plan C. If the grant does not get extended, have a plan for how you're going to spend those funds. And because I've had so many questions about this, I want to plan just a little informal chat with anyone who's interested about brainstorming some strategic and intentional ways of using Title II funds still aligned to your professional learning plans and your district needs that can be done in this short amount of time that's left in the FY20 grant period in case the federal government does not extend the FY20 grant period. So put that date on your calendar if that's something that you're interested in being a part of. Again, it's going to be very informal, probably no slides or anything, just a conversation about some national trends that are happening with Title II and how those funds are being spent across the country, but also just maybe what's being done locally as well. Did I intend to meet on a Sunday morning? Is that a Sunday? Oh, geez. No, it's not a Sunday. That's a Wednesday.
There is a question in the chat box from Jamie that's directed before Kelly and crew get off. Shall we assume our HR departments have heard this as well? I think that question is probably, they want to know that so that they know whether or not to put that person's name in the survey.
They have. HR directors and any certification staff are aware of this, but I do not know how many of them may be really paying attention. They've heard it. I can say that. They heard it. They are expecting, they've heard the same spiel from us that you just did. So that means that they're ready to be part of the team. So you'll have to decide whether to add their names.
Okay, so Jesse, I see that you were thinking it was December, but actually the due date for the evaluation report is the 31st, which is a Sunday. So really we should make that due date the 1st of February. We'll give you that extra day since the 31st is a Sunday for the due date for the final evaluation report. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, we do appreciate all of your time today. I know it was a lot of content today. It was very content heavy today. So we appreciate everybody who hung on for the remainder of the session today. And this whole session has been recorded. So we're gonna upload those recordings to our e-community. If you don't have access to the e-community, just send me an email and we'll get you added. It might take a day or two.
Welcome, distinguished guests, faculty, and graduates to the...
Oops.
I don't, it was my computer. Something started running on the background and I didn't touch anything.
Okay, well, thanks everybody, and wishing you guys a happy holiday. I hope you get to enjoy a few days off, and look forward to chatting with you in the new year.